Hi, welcome to the first lecture of 4 on Jim Pryor's paper, The Skeptic and the Dogmatist. This is a complex paper. It's our first foray into 21st century philosophy. Things just keep getting more complicated and precise, and the analyses get more technical and logical and careful. So I wanted to do this paper in part because it's connected with the stuff we've been talking about, sort of the logical continuation of a lot of the themes that we've been investigating. And it also provides, I think, a window into sort of where philosophy is at now. I mean, it's still 20 years old now, this paper, but it gives us sort of the flavor of contemporary epistemology. At least 21st century epistemology, early 21st century. This paper also marks the end of the abstract epistemology unit. So this is the sort of culmination of the unit on abstract epistemology. After this, we're going to switch to social epistemology. And specifically, we're going to start doing feminist epistemology. I'm going to try to walking north today, farther north than I usually go. So, let's see how far I can get. So the paper, The Skeptic and the Dogmatist, I think is most directly a continuation of G.E. Moore and Moore's hand argument. As many people have no doubt felt, a lot of people feel this way when they read Moore's argument. There's like something question-begging about it. And Moore does this great job of sort of addressing the initial worries and trying to and sort of setting the stage for a more complex, in-depth, question-begging type argument later. And so part of what this paper does is it sort of articulates the way, or one way in which the Moorean here's a hand argument seems to need some extra argumentation to get it going, like it's missing something. So Jim Pryor, his approach is he's trying to provide that extra something. So his aim in the paper is to defend a view that he calls perceptual dogmatism, and what exactly that view is going to be the subject of all 4 of these lectures in a way. Like, it's a complex view, so I want to take a little time to unpack it. It's hard to get a hold of. It's not hard to understand at first pass, but the more you think about it, it's a very complicated, subtle view. But one way of seeing the point of it is that it provides an explanation of why we should think of ourselves as justified by our perceptual experiences in the case of looking like here's a hand. The idea is that I'm justified in believing that here's a hand on the basis of my perceptual experience. So that's the view that Pryor wants to defend. So he's in Moore's camp. He's on the side of Moore. He's advancing Moore's arguments in some subtler and more sophisticated ways. Part of what's involved in that is actually developing the skeptic's argument in more subtle and sophisticated ways too. Like, what should the skeptic say back to Moore? That's part of what Jim Pryor is trying to do in the paper. So Pryor develops and defends this view called perceptual dogmatism. That's where the dogmatist, from the title The Skeptic and the Dogmatist, comes from. The skeptic is the one who denies that we have knowledge, and specifically Pryor's interested in the kind of skeptic that Moore was interested in. So the skeptic about the external world. And just again, one more time to remind you, the skeptic about the external world is not a person who denies that the external world exists. Skepticism is about not having knowledge. So the skeptic, the external world skeptic, just says we don't know the external world exists. We can't have knowledge of it. So that's the skeptic, and the dogmatist is the person who replies to the skeptic. So like I said, Pryor is a fan of Moore's, and he's trying to back up the Moorean argument. And he, in the beginning of the paper, points out two key contributions that Moore has made to epistemology, things that he likes, that Pryor likes, and things I also like. And I had pointed these things out in the last, in my lectures on Moore. The first is that we should be more certain in our knowledge that we have hands than we are in any of the premises of the skeptic's argument. And those premises include, for example, the claim that knowledge requires 100% certainty. So that's one of the things that both Moore and Jim Pryor think needs to be jettisoned. The other thing that he likes in Moore, that he finds in Moore, that he is also in support of, is the idea that we don't need to prove beyond 100% shadow of a doubt that our perception is reliable in order to trust it. So we can rely on perception to give us knowledge, even though we can't rule out the possibility that we're dreaming or that we're being deceived by an omnipotent being. But at the same time, Pryor thinks that Moore comes up short in a certain respect. He thinks Moore is stuck, or in fact just doesn't even really try to answer the question of how it is, like defending the idea that we should be allowed to trust our perception. Moore is a sort of dogmatist. He doesn't even defend the view, at least according to Pryor. I think that someone reading Moore could say something in his defense, like he does really say a few things to defend it. But from Pryor's perspective, what's missing from Moore's program, what's missing from Moore's argument, is a defense of the claim that we can trust our perception, that our perception can give us justification, even if we don't have a response to the skeptical scenario worry that we're being deceived. Oh, climbing this hill. So in setting up the paper, Pryor begins by granting two things to the skeptic of the external world. The first thing that he grants is that perception does not provide us with 100% certainty. So he thinks there's no way that we're going to show that I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the thing I appear to see, that the buds on this plant or whatever, we're not going to get a rebuttal that shows that with 100% certainty that we're not dreaming or that we're not being deceived by God or whatever. So perception always admits of some doubt. That's the first thing he grants to the skeptic. The second thing that he grants is a certain metaphysical possibility. The metaphysical possibility that we are dreaming. The metaphysical possibility that we're being deceived by an omnipotent being, or at least a more powerful being. So then the idea is, granting those two propositions, can we, starting with those assumptions, show that our perception is a source of justification anyway? That's what he wants to do. That's the aim of perceptual dogmatism, is to show that even if those two things are true, we can still, in some sense, trust our perceptions, or we can gain knowledge on the basis of our perceptions. Now, Pryor makes a really helpful distinction when he's talking about the skeptic. He talks about the difference between an ambitious anti-skeptical project and a modest anti-skeptical project. These are two different ways of trying to refute the skeptic. In the ambitious project, what you're trying to do is basically convince the skeptic on their own terms that they have knowledge of the external world. That means you're only allowed to use premises that the skeptic will accept. So if you're trying to convince the Cartesian skeptic, specifically that means you have to accept the principle that they adopt, which is that knowledge requires 100% certainty. So Pryor says, I'm not going to attempt the ambitious project. I'm not going to try to convince the skeptic that they know. And he really thinks I think that Pryor thinks you can't do that. As long as you're holding on to the skeptic's premises, specifically the one that says knowledge requires 100% certainty, you're not going to be able to overcome skepticism. So in that sense, the skeptic is like a lost cause, according to Pryor. But if you're not a radical skeptic, like he's not, and like I'm not on my good days anyway, there's this other thing you can do, what he calls the modest anti-skeptical project, which is that involves convincing yourself or explaining to yourself that you know things through your perception. And when you're convincing yourself, you don't necessarily have to hold on to every premise that the radical skeptic holds. And specifically the one that is most salient that we're giving up, that Pryor says we should let go of, is that knowledge requires 100% certainty. That's also what Moore says. So this is another way in which he's building on Moore. So the way that Pryor puts it, he says the modest project is that we should be able to explain to ourselves in a convincing way that we know such things as here is a hand on the basis of perception without contradicting any obvious or like sort of obvious, he says something like obvious facts about perception. Okay, so a large part of the paper is developing the skeptic as well as the dogmatist. That's something that we're going to get into more in the second lecture. That's going to be devoted to sort of giving the skeptic a new, more sophisticated view. Right now, I just want to focus on what's in the introduction to the paper. That's going to be the rest of this lecture. So, I can't remember if it's all actually in the introduction, but just the beginnings here. So Pryor develops these three characters right in the beginning. One of them is the skeptic, who I just roughly went over. The next is the perceptual dogmatist, who says, I think the next is the fallibilist. Anyway, there's this character, the fallibilist, and he contrasts that with the perceptual dogmatist. So I want to do that contrast. And I think that's as far as I want to go with this in this first lecture. I've been just wandering. I don't even know where I am exactly. I'm sure I'll just find my way back. Probably this way. Okay, so the fallibilist is just a person, more or less it suffices to be a fallibilist that you are one who denies that knowledge requires 100% certainty. So anyone who thinks that you can know something while also being fallible about that piece of knowledge is a fallibilist. So one of the things that Pryor mentions right at the outset after introducing fallibilism is that anybody who thinks that we have perceptual knowledge or knowledge based on experience has to be a fallibilist, given the thing that we ceded to the skeptic in the beginning, that perception never gives you 100% certainty. So he says, I actually think that most people are fallibilists because most people think that you can know things on the basis of seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, smelling. Okay, hold on. I gotta dodge some people on the street here. I'm trying to keep 20 feet. Okay, so the fallibilist is one position. The dogmatist is not a fully distinct position. A dogmatist is a type of fallibilist. Okay, so the perceptual dogmatist says, and this is a first pass statement of the view, that whenever it perceptually seems to you as if something is the case, whenever it perceptually seems to you as if P, then you have a kind of justification for believing that P, even in the absence of any other considerations. In other words, your justification doesn't rest on other beliefs being justified by other things. the way he puts it, the way he says it more specifically, is that your justification for P, derived from experience or perception, does not presuppose or rest on your justification for believing anything else. When you're perceptually justified, your justification doesn't depend on your being justified about any other proposition. So it's as if your perception gives you a kind of immediate license to believe whatever it is that you're experiencing. So just to unpack it, let's take some particularly relevant cases. One thing that the perceptual dogmatist doesn't think is required in order for your experiences to count as a source of justification is some kind of response to the radical skeptic's scenarios. So the skeptic comes at you with these worrying thought experiments, like you might be dreaming, you might be deceived by God or demon or whatever. And the skeptic's idea is that, well, you can't trust your perception. You can't trust that you're perceiving this tree. That can't be a source of justification, rather, until you've shown me why you don't have to. Why, in other words, until you've justified ignoring the demon possibility. So you don't have to, in other words, the dogmatist is saying, in order for your experience to justify your belief that there's a tree here, you don't need to be justified in believing that the skeptic's scenario doesn't obtain. You don't have to be justified in believing that you're not dreaming. The other helpful, illuminating thing that he says comes through by way of his contrasting the dogmatist with the fallibilist. So he says all perceptual dogmatists are fallibilists, but not all fallibilists are dogmatists. So I want to say a little bit about the fallibilist who's not a perceptual dogmatist, and I think that will help bring out what dogmatism is supposed to be. So a fallibilist is somebody who thinks that you can know something without being 100% certain. So knowledge doesn't entail 100% certainty. But most fallibilists, Pryor claims, at least at the time when he wrote this paper's been pretty convincing to people, but I actually don't know what the breakdown of views is. Anyway, sorry. So the ordinary fallibilist who's not a perceptual dogmatist thinks that there are explanations for why our perceptions are a reliable source of evidence. They think, for example, that there's a scientific explanation of why vision provides justification for beliefs. And it has to do with, there being retinas and a brain and light waves and all this causal order of the physical universe where, the light bounces off of the stuff in the environment and goes into your eyes. And that's part of the explanation for why your vision is reliable or just provides justification. So for this kind of fallibilist, it's a crucial part of the story is that we have a scientific explanation for why our perceptions are reliable. But that kind of fallibilist runs into the skeptic without a defense for their claim that perception is reliable, because the skeptic will say, so you have all this stuff to say about brains and retinas and light waves, but all of your evidence, supposed evidence for the existence of brains and light waves and stuff comes from your experience, your perception, your observations in science. You might have been dreaming all of that, or the demon has deceived you about science. So you can't appeal to a scientific explanation about how the brain or the eye works in order to justify your claim that your visual experiences are a source of evidence or justification. So the ordinary fallibilist is thinks that there are scientific explanations for why our experiences are a source of justification. But the perceptual dogmatist, on the other hand, doesn't think that we need a scientific explanation of where our justification comes from in terms of our experience. A perceptual dogmatist doesn't think you need to scientifically prove or explain how vision works in order to trust it. You get to just trust it automatically. It's like a basic feature of our existence as knowledge-seeking beings, is that our experiences are a source of justification. They don't need to be justified by any further knowledge or further beliefs. So To put this together with the definition of dogmatism, perceptual dogmatism says that when I have an experience as of perceiving a tree here, my having a justification for first of all have a justification for believing that there is a tree, and my justification doesn't depend on or rest on my justification for any other beliefs, including any scientific beliefs or beliefs about how my physical body works or beliefs that I have a physical body. It doesn't depend on anything at all. It's primitive. It's sort of immediate. It doesn't come from, it's not supported by something else. It's not necessarily supported by something else, I should say. Yeah. So later when we get into the details of this, it gets more, like I said, subtle, complicated, because the perceptual dogmatist can also say that there are scientific explanations for where how our perception works. But the crucial feature of their view is that we don't need those explanations in order to trust our perceptions. And in fact, the dogmatist thinks they can do a lot better at explaining how our perception works, because we can use perception in the first place to do science, trust our perception in the first place to get scientific explanations going, and then those scientific explanations can actually tell us how our bodies work, that we even have bodies and so on. Okay, so that's a preview for later. Okay, so how do I know that there are yellow flowers here? Both the fallibilist and the perceptual dogmatist will say, and pretty much everyone will say, it's because of my visual experience, I'm perceiving it. How do I know I can trust my visual experience? That's a question that the skeptic raises. The fallibilist says, well, we don't have to be 100% certain that we're not dreaming in order to trust that there are really these flowers here. And the perceptual dogmatist thinks the same thing. So how do they differ from each other? Well, the typical fallibilist wants to say something like, we know that our perceptual experiences are a source of justification because we know how the visual system works, and we know about this through science. So we've studied it, and we know that the light rays are coming off of the flowers and entering the retina, and being processed by the visual cortex, and so on and so forth. So there's an explanation given about why the flowers are, why our perception of the flowers counts as justification. The perceptual dogmatist says, I don't need to bother with that kind of explanation. I don't need a scientific explanation about where this justification comes from, or I don't need any explanation about why I should be able to trust my visual experience. It's enough that I'm having the experience. That basic fact with no support beyond that simple fact that I'm experiencing the visual perception that I am is sufficient to give me some justification. It's not enough to give me absolute justification, but it gives me some justification, as in that justification is fallible. It could be overturned by other evidence, like if I found out I really was dreaming, or if I found out that that there's a hologram here or something like that. So but I think that's everything I wanted to do in this first lecture. So stay tuned for parts 2, 3, and 4.